The recent outbreak of COVID-19 has generated a great deal of interest in America's last major deadly pandemic, the Spanish influenza of 1918. This presentation will take a not so fond look at what was happening in relation to the Spanish flu here in Aurora. First of all, a little background. In the waning days of a great war, the world found itself facing an even deadlier enemy that was no respecter of persons or national conflicts. The H1N1 virus's origin is unknown. According to reports, the first documented case appeared March 11, 1918 at Fort Riley in Kansas, and the virus spread to other military camps of the time. This wave of the epidemic seemed to be relatively mild, and since most of the people infected would recover in a few days, there were considerably fewer deaths recorded. Subsequently, many of these soldiers were shipped to France, and the unsanitary conditions resulting from trench warfare and malnutrition created conditions for the virus to flourish. Why Spanish influenza? The pandemic was dubbed Spanish influenza thanks to the ongoing World War. Governments, to maintain wartime morale, minimized early reports of the disease, while neutral countries like Spain, whose King Alfonso XIII was a sufferer, freely reported about the epidemic in May of 1918, leading people to assume the sickness started in Spain. Approximately 500 million people, almost one-third of the global population at the time, came down with the virus. Worldwide deaths have been estimated to be between 17 and 50 million victims. The wide discrepancy can be attributed to the secondary infections like respiratory complications or pneumonia that were often the recorded cause of death. During the first major wave of Spanish flu, there were no vaccines to fight the illness, and since there were considerably fewer antibiotics available then, many doctors prescribed aspirin to help with the symptoms, advising 30 milligrams per day, which is over 7 times the safe dosage recommended today. As a result, aspirin poisoning may have contributed to more fatalities. The pandemic returned to the United States through Boston Harbor, aboard the troop and supply ships coming out of Europe. With many sick or furloughed soldiers moving to military camps, hospitals, or simply returning home on leave, all this movement spread the Spanish flu throughout the nation. Figures show that 40% of Navy personnel and 36% of the Army were infected before the disease ran its course. Half of the U.S. casualties from World War I died from the Spanish flu rather than being killed in battle. In the United States, 25 to 28% of the population came down with the disease, and 675,000 died before the epidemic was brought under control. Most fatalities took place among those under 5 years of age, people between the ages of 20 and 40, and those 65 and older. In the aftermath of the pandemic, life expectancy in the U.S. dropped by 12 years. Turning to the local front of the pandemic, the first beacon news coverage of the Spanish flu was in an editorial dated Tuesday, September 17, 1918. Here, it was noted that there was an outbreak along the Atlantic seaboard, quote, among the men engaged in military and naval service. The newspaper further stated, warning has been given to the people to pay special attention to health and hygiene rules, as a robust physical condition is one of the best safeguards against contracting the influenza. And people are urged to avoid overcrowded and badly ventilated places, infection from drinking cups, and other practices likely to imperil the safety of themselves and others. Within 4 days, another article noted that about 1,000 men at Great Lakes Naval Camp on the shores of Lake Michigan had come down with the disease, and one death had already occurred. The sickness was spreading into Chicago and the northern suburbs. Camp Grant at Rockford, taking alarm by these reports, canceled all Liberty passes for anyone leaving that city. Ironically, in that same Saturday, September 21 issue, another article in the Beacon promoted a military concert to be given at Phillips Park the following day by, you guessed it, the Camp Grant Base Hospital Band. The director of this musical troupe, formerly from Aurora, wanted his hometown to, quote, show the boys we're back of them, even if it is a gasless Sunday. Let everybody walk out and lead the streetcars for the old men and the kiddies. This event certainly had the potential to bring the infection to our city. 1 week later, the newspaper reported that there are a number of cases in Aurora and more developing each day. One local doctor had already seen 4 or 5 new patients that same day. Private Remer Schroeder from the Mooseheart War Camp became the first local casualty, dying at the Aurora Hospital from, quote, pneumonia following the Spanish influenza on Wednesday, October 2nd. 3 other recruits from Mooseheart were also in the hospital at the time. Quote, about 50 of the 103 soldiers at the camp have been afflicted. Dr. Lou N. Byers, who the Beacon states is a brilliant woman and a capable physician, died the next day. Her brother Howard, an instructor at the Joseph G. Broad Military School, had come down with the Spanish influenza. Despite having a cold and being confined to her bed at the time, Dr. Byers went into Chicago to help nurse Howard back to health. He died the day after she joined him in the city, and she herself died 5 days later on Thursday, October 3rd. Another soldier, William A. Elliott, succumbed at the city hospital Friday, October 4th. Captain Callister, commander of the Mooseheart troops, informed the Beacon that the disease was well under control at the camp, and 5 of the 6 men currently under treatment at the hospital were doing nicely. In other news, Rockford's Camp Grant was now under quarantine, and all weekend furloughs were suspended. Saturday, October 5th, 2 area men died at military camps. One in Texas, Harry Von Miller of Aurora, and Private Thomas White of Oswego at Camp Grant. The next day, a new appeal called for embalmers to come to Camp Grant, quote, to assist hundreds of other embalmers from many cities prepare bodies of soldiers for burial. W.H. Healy, A.N. Healy, and a visitor from Nebraska, O.L. Schumann, rushed to the scene in response to a telegram received October 5th. Lloyd Banker, George Boyle, Albert Denny, all of Aurora, and Carl Harold from Batavia soon followed. 50 additional embalmers from Chicago had already gone to help at the stricken camp. The article further noted that the A.L. Hill Casket Company, the nation's largest supplier, had been taken over by the U.S. government for the duration of the epidemic. Dr. George Schwatchkin, Aurora's health inspector, reported, quote, numberless cases within this city. A 2-part 10-step guide on how to keep from getting influenza and another 10-step what to do if you have influenza appeared on page 3 of the same Beacon. Things like avoiding contact with others, keeping the hands clean, no spitting, and covering the mouth and nose when sneezing were listed. Mrs. Peter Zimbelman, residing on Mountain Street, who nursed 2 soldier sons after they contracted the virus and, having survived a bout of her own, offered her services to help with other cases of the Spanish flu. The article stated that she was anxious to go to Great Lakes Naval Base as a nurse. Meanwhile, downstate at the University of Illinois, Aurora native and daughter of the West Side School Superintendent Lucille McDowell was fighting the infection. Her mother rushed to Champaign-Urbana to assess her daughter's condition, and Mrs. McDowell was able to report that Lucille had slightly improved. Mrs. McDowell noted that, quote, the lack of nurses is greatly felt in that locality. By Monday, October 7th, it was acknowledged that the Camp Grant situation was bad, and Dr. Swatchkin issued his statement, if the influenza epidemic reaches much greater proportions in Aurora, the health department will close schools, amusement places, and public gatherings in order to check the spread of the malady. The city's doctors were directed to report all cases to the health department. For those already afflicted, it was noted that the patient must be isolated in a room in the home, and there must be no communication between such patient and the other members of the family. Of the embalmers who reported to Camp Grant, it was found that, quote, the work in hand was of such magnitude as to try them to the utmost, for including the 95 deaths on Saturday, October 5th, 300 bodies were in the morgue. October 7th also saw the death announcement for Private Edward S. McCormick, who ironically had been born in an army camp when his father was engaged in the Spanish-American War, and who now also died in camp at Camp Grant. McCormick had originally been sent to the hospital for kidney trouble, and he contracted the virus while there. On Tuesday, October 8th, a Beacon article discussed the steps being taken at local movie theaters to stop the spread of the disease. No one with a persistent cough or cold symptoms was to be admitted. All the city theaters were disinfected several times each day. Anyone coughing while in the theaters was advised to cover their mouth. If it was felt the cough merited action, the person would be asked to leave and to get a refund from the box office. In other news for this Tuesday, October 8th, Aurora now had, quote, at least 500 persons afflicted with Spanish influenza who were under the care of physicians. Alarmingly, only 40 such cases had been reported to the health department. Over at Camp Grant, yet another Aurora native, Charlie Curtin, was reported dead. Also on the 8th, Alderman Philip Mueller of the 7th Ward, at the request of a number of taxpayers, introduced a resolution to the City Council to have the Department of Streets wash the pavements in the business district at least once a week. Surprisingly, lemons were being touted as a natural way to fight the infection. Quote, unaccountable barrels of hot lemonade have been drunken to drown the flu germs. This has caused a lemon shortage in America. This next day, Wednesday, October 9th, it was noted that an overnight rain cleaned the city streets somewhat. And Shpachkin felt that, quote, in but few Spanish flu cases is the malady found to be of serious nature. The epidemic is well under control. In Aurora, the infection appeared to affect younger adults, with but few children and older residents being afflicted. The next day, October 10th, an article stated that our local hospitals received a communication from the State Board of Health to bar visitors unless a critical illness or death was involved. In such cases, the hospital authorities are instructed to take every precaution to protect the other inmates of the institution as well as visitors. Once again, Aurora embalmers went to assist at Camp Grant and reported a vast improvement since Sunday, the 6th. These men were receiving $7.50 per day and expenses for their services. Despite Shpachkin's optimism, on Saturday, October 12th, he decided to conduct a census in Aurora's public schools to see how many students had a case of the virus in their homes so he could determine whether a shutdown would be advisable. At that time, only 50 new cases of Spanish influenza were reported that day. On Sunday, October 13th, an Aurora quarantine was announced to begin the next day. All schools were closed indefinitely. Theaters, amusement venues, churches, social gatherings, and public meetings were shut down as well. Quote, to meet the emergency of the influenza epidemic, and all rulings in force and effect will be carried out to the letter. Anyone aware of a case of Spanish flu was expected to report the same to the health department. These measures were deemed necessary when it was discovered that the overwhelmed doctors of the city had not been reporting all the patients under their care. Quote, in fact, more than 200 cases were reported yesterday, the article noted. An anti-spitting ordinance was put in place, and Shpachkin stated that it would be, quote, radically enforced. School buildings were slated to be thoroughly fumigated, and such work commenced the day before. There were at least 1,000 known cases of the epidemic in Aurora at the time. 33 deaths had resulted so far. Monday, October 14th, Shpachkin reinforced the closures of the day before by stating that they included every place where people come and stay, not where people come and go, as in stores and saloons. No Red Cross meetings, no Ladies' Aid meetings. According to the rulings, however, the Aurora Public Library was not closed. The Tuesday, October 15th Beacon carried an article in which the State Board of Health issued a desperate plea for medical help to go to portions of a state where the need was greater. In the same issue of the newspaper, Schwachkin still remained relatively optimistic despite the growing numbers of local cases, stating that largely owing to the cooperation of the people of Aurora, the influenza is under control. Apparently, he was receiving criticism from the community for allowing saloons and bowling alleys to remain open, and it was pointed out in the article that these places were exempt, quote, in accordance with ruling made all over the state. He did, however, discourage patronage at such establishments, but indicated that they would remain open unless orders from Springfield decreed otherwise. The Aurora Public Library was now only taking return items. All checkouts were suspended, but the reading room remained open from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. It was reiterated that public funerals were now forbidden, and marriages were included in this ruling. To date, there were 39 deaths in Aurora. Wednesday, October 16th. With only 8 deaths in the past 24 hours, once again, Schwachkin expressed his opinion that the epidemic was clearing. According to him, many of these fatalities had been fighting the disease for a few days, and the real figure to consider was the number of new cases being reported, that being 22. However, he also noted that not all physicians have reported. They have been busy, yet it is necessary that they report. He also stated that the quarantine might be lifted by early the following week should conditions remain relatively stable. Quote, some complaints have reached Schwachkin that too large crowds have congregated in the pool halls and in 1 or 2 stores, but the doctor says that he cannot close one store unless he closes them all, as reported by the Beacon News. The state of affairs at Aurora's 3 hospitals was discussed in the same article. The old St. Charles Hospital was setting up makeshift wards in the halls to accommodate patients since visitors were now restricted. At St. Joseph's, quote, they have any number of serious cases of pneumonia besides several cases of surgery. The nurses there are rushed caring for the sick. The Aurora Hospital, quote, has its share of sickness, although there are several rooms that can be used in emergency cases. Thursday, October 17th, 97 new cases and 5 deaths due to pneumonia triggered by the Spanish flu were reported. The jump in the number of new patients was attributed to the fact that, quote, physicians are now called far more quickly in influenza cases than during the early days of the epidemic, and also that physicians are reporting much more carefully than at first. The obituary column for that day recorded 7 deaths, all but one listed pneumonia as the actual cause of death. Friday, October 18th, quote, 7 or 8 deaths of pneumonia and influenza have been reported by the undertakers in the last 24 hours. The streetcars and stations were being disinfected daily by this point in the pandemic, and one railway official stated that they are short of help owing to having a number of men off with the Spanish influenza. It was also announced that, quote, there would be no Sunday football games among the semi-pros in Aurora next Sunday. They must abide by the same instructions that made it necessary to cancel the 2 high school games for tomorrow. And the number of infections kept growing. Saturday, October 19th, 84 new Spanish flu cases were reported, quote, in addition to the 72 new cases announced to the press earlier in the day, reports the Beacon. Opening what would become a major can of worms, quote, Health Commissioner George B. Schwachkin issued a statement emphasizing the fact that despite pressure to get him to allow churches to open tomorrow, he could not grant the request, adding that no church services must be held. Another article from the very same day stated that Frank G. Beardsley, the first congregational minister and member of the Aurora Ministerial Association, after a conference with health officials, declared that no members of the association would conduct service. According to Beardsley, they acquiesced cheerfully and heartily in obeying the orders of the city health officer. We willingly forego the usual services if in any way it may hasten the end of the epidemic. There will be no services at any of the new churches in the Alliance tomorrow. The People's Church pastor, Charles A. Alden, further stated, quote, all regular services will be entirely and cheerfully subject to the local health requirements. Human safety is salvation. An article on page 3 of the October 19th Beacon focused on how local women were spending their time during the quarantine, and they were, quote, seizing the opportunity to clean house, to sew, and to do what they can. With the fall harvest season well underway, many of Aurora's ladies were canning fruits and vegetables for the winter. Sunday, October 20th. Quote, the businessman who insists upon speeding up Sunday breakfast, tearing down the street to his chosen temple of divine worship, and of breaking into the auditorium this morning in order to attend church services, will find himself in short order upon his way to the city Bastille, because church services will positively not be tolerated or permitted, was the statement by Strachkin. Further, more than that, if this epidemic grows in proportion to its climb during the past few days, everything will be closed next week. Yes, I mean everything. Saloons and everything. A corps of men was stationed around the city to locate people violating the rules against social gatherings, as 100 new cases of the Spanish flu had been reported the evening before. Quote, we have got to pull together and keep everything closed up if we want to stamp this out. Chicago apparently was trying out a vaccine, and questions were raised about using the same here. Schwachkin's response was, we will let Chicago experiment first and see what the results are. On October 21st, it was reported that the total number of Spanish influenza cases to date numbered less than 1,500, according to Schwachkin, and 500 people had survived a bout with the deadly disease. Once again, he had hopes that conditions would stabilize and the quarantine could be lifted before the end of the week. It was noted that the day before, Sunday, was very peaceful. He states, quote, there was no reason for going to other towns because all had the puritanical cloak on and were even duller than Aurora. Little train travel took place, and few took advantage of a gas Sunday. Wartime restrictions having been placed on gasoline sales, the town was so quiet that a thumb-twiddling contest would have attracted a throng. Reverend Leon Linden took this opportunity to protest the closing of the churches by citing a proclamation from the state health commissioner in which places of worship were excluded from being shut down during the pandemic. Quote, being law-abiding citizens, we naturally followed orders because all authority should be respected. But I still question the advisability and the prudence of the emphatic demand as found in your paper of Saturday and Sunday. It savors of the prehistoric ages, when people were forced to obey the wishes of a single individual and suffer the consequences. By closing the churches, people now believe that they are the breeding places of germs and diseases, that they are not fit places to send children and adults to, for fear they might contract a malady. In an October 22nd article, Aurora Mayor James E. Hurley issued orders, quote, that there must be no congregating in saloons, billiard halls, bowling alleys, or in other public places. If one went for a drink at one of the local taverns, they were to order immediately, consume their potent potable, and depart. As for the pool halls and bowling alleys, quote, people may go to play, but they must not use the rooms as loafing places. Citizens were chafing under all the restrictions, and they began calling for the theaters to reopen, so there was some form of recreation for those without an automobile. It was reported 2 days after the fact that inspectors had stopped people from entering St. Nicholas Church. Further, that several others already were gathered inside the building, and all were required to leave at once. Father Weber of St. Nicholas stated that the church has a rule that requires them to be open for certain hours of every day. Upon hearing that, the father couldn't keep parishioners out. Schwachkin said emphatically, quote, I can, and I will, and I did. Pastor Linden's letter from the day before prompted additional letters from other Beacon readers. One stating, quote, the health commissioner has no power to close the churches. The constitutional protection of freedom of worship is supreme over any order that a health commissioner may give. Pointing out that there was no central body in the Aurora faith community, no affiliation, quote, exists between Protestants and Catholics. The Reverend Charles Alden, who just days before had no issue with the church closures, called for forming an interdenominational body to discuss matters, such as the church closures, that did not involve any questions of theology. In another article on the 22nd, the Burlington Railroad reported that many of their workers were sick. Despite the staff absences, the vacancies hadn't affected rail service at that point. However, a breakdown of the situation showed out of 580 station employees, 17 were sick. Out of 65 office staff, none were out sick. Out of 128 conductors, 8 were sick. Out of 227 brakemen, 26 were sick. Out of 6 collectors, none were sick. Out of 142 switchmen, 15 were sick. And out of 940 maintenance workers, 76 had come down with the Spanish influenza. After 2 days with relatively few reports of new cases, Shwachkin once again issued a statement that the quarantine might be lifted in a few days. There were still about 1,000 persons ill of influenza and pneumonia, a decrease of 500 from the first official list 10 days ago. Only 30 new cases were reported to my office this morning, he stated. And again, Judge F.M. Annis returned to the controversy over the church closures, refuting Pastor Alden's opinion that, quote, the officials of the city in the interest of the general health of the people have no right to interfere for the time with services in churches. Annis argued that, quote, the Board of Health is doing just what it has a right to do. Further, he compared Reverend Alden to a, quote, bovine who stood rampant upon the railroad tracks when he saw an engine with a train of cars encroaching upon his constitutional rights. There was still a war going on in Europe, so despite the pandemic, Army recruits resumed training October 23rd. All men who reported were examined by medical staff, and 4 men were sent home due to health concerns. Several Aurora citizens gathered at the Aurora Armory to watch the soldiers drill, and these onlookers were summarily ordered to leave. It was reported that, quote, men who are sick enough to stay away from drill must furnish a doctor's certificate so that effect an order to have their record clean on the rolls that go with the men to camp. And here we have the 6th and last member of the Johnson family dying from pneumonia triggered by the Spanish flu. Another major overnight rain had cleaned the city streets, and as Shwachkin stated in his October 24th update, put the kibosh on the germ. According to reports he received from other parts of the state, Aurora has been coming out better than most of the towns. It is simply because we took hold of this epidemic in time and stopped public meetings before the epidemic reached a point where we could not handle it. Shwachkin expressed his opinion that quarantine might be lifted by Sunday, October 27th. Should conditions warrant by Friday, he would allow church services that weekend. Thanks to new orders issued by the State Health Board, closed, absolutely closed, is the sum and substance of the condition of all meeting places in Aurora over Sunday, and possibly for another week, was the news from October 25th. The count of Spanish influenza cases in Aurora was at 1,000, and 97 people were dead at that point. The increase in the number of influenza and pneumonia cases here is largely due to a telephone dragnet for the purpose of ascertaining what physicians, if any, were failing to report cases to the health department. Telephone calls have proved that a number of local physicians, either because of rush of work, forgetfulness, or an evasion of this duty, have turned in no reports at all. In the ensuing rush to come into compliance, one Aurora doctor reported 80 previously undocumented cases. Due to conditions at the local hospitals, the Aurora Country Club announced they would open their facility for overflow patients, as similar organizations around the nation had done. Round 4, I think. In another protest of the church closures, the Beacon printed a letter from Louise Titsworth, who pointed to the saloons and pool rooms that were still operating and noted the, quote, enormous amount of work that churches have ahead of them in the redeeming, to some extent, the spiritual tone of this city. The people of Aurora do not need Judge Annis or any other non-churchgoer to champion a cause that necessitates the closing of places of worship. On October 26th, Shwachkin estimated that there were now 1,500 cases of Spanish influenza in Aurora. Quote, so busy are the physicians that it is difficult to secure time to make complete reports. In the past 24 hours, quote, at least one half of the Aurora doctors recorded 1,069 cases. There had been apparently some criticism leveled at the downtown Woolworth store, and its manager, Max Gelpel, issued a statement indicating that early in the pandemic, he spoke with Shwachkin for advice on how to weather the emergency. Gelpel noted that all sales which might attract a crowd had been suspended, and the store was, quote, thoroughly fumigated and disinfected from time to time. He believed his establishment was, quote, much better than some other stores. In yet more volleys over the controversial church closures, Mrs. M. E. Wilson's letter to the editor appeared in which she urged the utmost caution. Quote, this is a fight with death. Better to close for a month than to allow this malady to increase at the rate it has in the past 24 hours. This is a time to be patient, you that are well. Conversely, P.W. Reed's letter also appeared. In it, he states, quote, all true Christians put the soul above the body. The soul's interests are supreme. Reed further declared, we ought to obey God rather than man. The writer is old-fashioned enough to believe that God would not cause them to suffer who are obeying his will. As a matter of fact, who knows what but that our sins are bringing this epidemic upon us. In a Sunday, October 27th article, the East and West Side school districts dismissed the idea of holding Saturday classes for students to make up lost work. It simply means a series of readjustments, and should schools open a week from Monday, we will arrange such readjustment. This courtesy of a West Side Superintendent McDowell. After emphasizing the need for people to avoid standing in the streetcars and calling for more cars to be put into service, Shvachkin stated, the epidemic is still of such nature as to necessitate the greatest precaution. There must absolutely be no let-up in the tight-as-a-drum character of the closing of the city. New cases reported the day before numbered another 103 infected people, and Aurora deaths at that point were approximately 100. Barbara Green issued a call for some of the out-of-school boys to help at their factory. They could, quote, pick up a few extra jitneys while waiting for the influenza ban to be lifted. Many of the company's regular employees were shut down with the Spanish flu. As reported by the city health officer, there is reason to believe that Aurora's fight with the influenza scourge has been to good purpose and that victory is in sight. Not more than 75 cases have been reported in the last 48 hours. With Halloween just around the corner, Shvachkin urged people to avoid planning any parties. Pastor Freeborn D. Brooke of the First Methodist Church continued the controversy over the church closings. According to him, quote, our city is sick. Multitudes of our neighbors are being carried to their graves. Sorrow fills the air. We have created state and city boards of health just for such times as this. In the judgment of these bodies, it is unsafe for the public to congregate. It is the duty of the state to prevent such public assemblies. Dr. Shvachkin, as public health officer, should be commended for his firm stand in this matter and deserves the unqualified endorsement and full support of the churches of our city. In another October 28th article, the Beacon reported that the movie theaters had used the 2-week closure to thoroughly fumigate their premises and, quote, if any germs are still alive in the places they possess a remarkable staying power. The managers anticipated a flood of people once the quarantine was lifted and the movie houses could reopen. By this point, most Spanish influenza patients in Aurora were regarded as out of danger, but still needed to be kept in quarantine to avoid infecting others. Only 35 new cases were reported that day. Quote, the condition is most certainly improving. There have been 107 deaths in the city by that time. While there were still an estimated 500 cases in Aurora, around 300 of them were at least a week old, and the sufferers were well on the way to recovery. Only 31 new cases were reported on October 30th, as the number of new infections declined. Shvachkin stated, I am hoping that conditions will be such that when we open up, everything may be opened at the same time, churches, theaters, schools, and everything. After looking over the state of affairs in Aurora, the Illinois Health Department gave Shvachkin the go-ahead to allow the churches to be open for worshipers on Sunday, November 3rd, and further to reopen the schools on Monday, November 4th. Affidavits were being sent for signatures from Aurora Mayor J.E. Harley and Shvachkin, and if the state officials were satisfied, the entire quarantine could be lifted. The state imposed strict instructions, quote, in every instance of entire opening or partial opening of institutions, that those in charge pay rigid attention to the health of those requesting entrance. Schools had to provide daily medical examinations for all teachers and students. Anyone with a sign of illness was to be sent home. Only 24 new Spanish influenza cases were reported by noon that Halloween day. Perhaps as a reflection of the growing confidence that Aurora had weathered the worst of the pandemic, most of the news reports on this day focused on conditions in Batavia and Geneva. Batavia had apparently delayed in issuing a quarantine. However, to that point, there had only been about 25 cases of the virus and 1 death. In Geneva, 10 new cases were reported, the largest number of new cases during the run of the pandemic up to that time, and there have been no hometown fatalities. The people of Aurora were becoming impatient with the slow reopening of the city, and the Beacon lamented the public's, quote, seeming inability to understand that orders are orders. In time of epidemic, the State Department of Health is supreme. To placate those who weren't happy with the quarantine restrictions, Schmotchkin issued this statement. It is possible the ban will be lifted the latter part of next week. More than that I cannot say. It all depends upon the condition from day to day, which we report to the State Department of Health, which in turn issues orders as to our actions. There was a chance that movie theaters could be open by Wednesday, but such a decision was still subject to change. Quote, in the meantime, there can be no public weddings and funerals and no public gatherings. The reading circles, which are announcing meetings Mondays, are going against the law and cannot have such meetings. The situation is improving, and there are fewer cases, but as the mayor and the health physician said once and for all, nothing doing socially until orders are received from the state, stated the Beacon. On the Aurora Public Library front, Schmotchkin, quote, advises that the public library remain closed as far as the issuance of books is concerned a few days longer. He also assured the public that the library reading room would be thoroughly fumigated the following day. An article on page 3 of the November 3rd Beacon estimated that the theater closures had cost local operators upwards of $10,000. The Beacon stated, while dollars and cents are not placed in the balance by thinking people with disaster and death, yet it must be admitted that to carry this loss gallantly and cheerfully is worth the commendation. November 4th, it was announced that the quarantine would be lifted that same evening. As this news spread throughout the city, quote, the populace not otherwise engaged got out the timbrels, the harp, and the cornet, for great was the rejoicing in Aurora. According to Schmotchkin, there were no new reports of Spanish influenza cases by 1 o'clock that afternoon, and only 12 reported cases from the day before. At the local schools, East High opened with not more than a dozen absentees. 4 sniffers were sent home, and 1 or 2 coming from homes where there still existed a form of influenza. Across the river, there were no absences at West High. It was announced that the Star and B theaters would be raising admissions to cover losses during the pandemic. The price of a ticket to those establishments doubled from 5 to 10 cents. The Aurora public was starving for entertainment, and it was noted that several residents traveled to Chicago the day before to gain entrance from the theaters there. Quote, thousands of all King County towns were in Chicago. They wanted professional entertainment, and Aurora's streets resembled those of a Montana rural district. At this point, news covering Aurora dried up for a time. Over the course of the next 2 days, there were updates on the situation in Geneva, where 70 cases of the Spanish influenza were reported. However, the quarantine there was lifted on November 6th. According to sources that were consulted to compile information for this presentation, later in November, the nation was subjected to yet another wave of the pandemic. Stay tuned for Chapter 2.